Welcome to session 2 on reading of Leviticus. Hopefully you've all done your reading and read the whole of Leviticus 1 and been enamoured with how it's gone. But what we're going to do is briefly look at the structure of the whole of the book, then we're going to get down into the verses. There's many different ways of splitting up Leviticus, so many different books, so you can split it different ways, but I think the two cleanest ways of splitting it up as a book to help us absorb it is the first way is splitting it up into 6 bits, where you've got the first 5 main sacrificial offerings on chapters 1 to 7. The second bit is the institution, the putting the priests in to place in worship. The third bit, that's chapters 8 to 10. The third bit is kind of just looking at the whole idea of clean and unclean, what makes one the other, and the difference between the two. That's chapters 11 to 15. Then you get the kind of almost like the turning point of the whole book. The focus of the whole book is the Day of Atonement in chapter 16, and then section 5. You look at holy living. How do you outwork this? Chapters 17 to 26, and then the kind of almost like a kind of footnote to the whole book is offering vows to the Lord. That's chapters 27. So that's kind of splitting up into 6. Or we can look at it as splitting up into 2 bits, where you got chapters 1 to 16, which is almost kind of addressed to priests. That's like almost a manual, like a barbecue manual for priests. Chapters 1 to 16, and then the second bit is chapters 17 to 27, where its teachings actually addressed to the people. So the first bit looks at the priests and their role on identifying stuff and doing stuff, and all within the tabernacle and the temple. And then the second half, 17 to 27, is looking at the teachings, is looking at how all this works out for the people. So it's priests and people. But we're going to start by looking at verse 1. So if you open up your Bibles, we're going to start by reading Leviticus 1, verse 1. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. You seem to have jumped right into the middle of the story, and you're just left with loads of questions. If this book was presented to you in isolation from all the rest of the Bible, you're left with questions. Who is Moses? Who is the Lord? And what the heck is a tent of meeting? All very valid questions, and questions that will either become clear eventually, or actually become clear because we've said, look, the Exodus and Leviticus come together like a puzzle. You can't really read it in isolation. One goes into the other. It'll help our understanding if we know the story of Exodus. As I pointed out in the first session, it's joined together. The people of God bound in slavery, liberated by God, and having the very presence of God found in their midst. How do they worship when they've gone from a situation of slavery in Egypt to a place in the desert? Moses is left at the end of the story in Exodus 40 on a cliff edge almost. If you read Exodus 40 verse 35, Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So there is their God amongst them, and he can't enter. The Lord, and we can't enter. So then we have Leviticus 1 verse 1. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him. We're amongst a people who are in covenant with God. Now, a covenant is a form of treaty that was from ancient Near Eastern times. Other communities did it, other religions did covenants, and they're signed between 2 distinct parties. We have a conquering king and a conquered people. 2 different people, and they came to this agreement. One side said, I'm the conquering king, and I'm here now. I've slain your warriors, your best warriors, and I'm now a king over you. I'm almost like a god over you, and you must worship me, and you give me your riches, your best looking women, and worship me. Okay. The other side, the expectation is that the conquered people, the other part of this covenant, they are expected to give almost a taxation to this new conquered king, to this person they're almost treating like a god, and that is the relationship between a conquered king and his peoples. And that's the idea of a covenant: the conquering king and the conquered people. If we go back into Genesis, we find a bit of the backstory of this covenant, which is between Abraham and his family. You will be, if we do Genesis 17, you will be the father of many nations. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. The whole land of Canaan, where you reside as a foreigner, I will give to you as an everlasting possession. Genesis 17, 1 to 8. The other side of that covenant is Genesis 17, verse 1. Verse 1, walk before me faithfully and blameless. As we saw in the first session, whole of Leviticus is about worship, and within worship is the expectation of justice and mercy. That reference from Micah 6. Now, the now chosen people, not conquered, chosen people are now in covenant with God. So a kind of ancient Near Eastern biblical view of covenant is conquered king, conquered people. These are a chosen people and one God. And the expectation of worship, of the one true God, and the expectation of their worship is to walk humbly and seek justice. As you'll no doubt be aware, the rest of the Old Testament is taken up with the ongoing falling in and out of relationship with God on forms of justice. And we can read all the different books of the Bible where that relationship turns sour because of the behavior of his chosen, not conquered people. So let's move on to Leviticus 1 verse 2. Where are we? When anyone amongst you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. So the expectation is that of worship, not if, but when. And the expectation of that worship is that it will cost. It is something of value. If you bring something, a burnt offering, you offer something from the herd or from the flock, it will cost you to do that. So the expectation is not if you worship, but when, and it is going to be costly. Verse 2, it'll be from it'll be either from the herd or the flock. Then we get this amazing aspect set out in Leviticus of worship. The idea that worship is accessible to everyone of any economic standing. How would it be if the expectation of a burnt offering was a bull and only a bull, and you couldn't afford a bull? But set out from the beginning in verse 1 of Leviticus, we have a guide to worship. The idea that the expectation of worship is for all. If you have a bull, offer a bull. It's got to be a good one, no shoddy seconds. If you can't afford a bull, something from the flock, a good one, no shoddy seconds. So even if you're destitute, you can spare the time and the effort to actually find something that is of worth to give as an offering. Without defect, that is your worship. So actually, given that expectation that worship is open to all, it gives us another insight into reading Luke 19. When Jesus enters the temple courts, he began to drive out those who were selling. It is written, he said to them, my house will be a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of robbers. Every day he was teaching in the temple, but the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the leaders amongst them were trying to kill him. Yet they could not find any way to do it because all the people hung on his words. So we get Jesus, the cleansing, the driving out of the robbers. And the tradition is that Jesus was clearing out the outer courts of the temple where the money lenders were money changers were, and the people selling temple-approved animals for sacrifice. You can only use temple money in the temple. As with most things, you ended up on like this. You end up on the losing end of the exchange. You end up losing money, having to change the money. You end up having to buy the better thing because they're selling it, and no other offering is worth. They're putting barriers up to access of worship of God. Just leaving you with a thought. When have we put barriers up between God and someone who wants to worship him? When has our motivation, expectation, or presentation of worship stopped other people accessing God? Now, these questions are just as applicable to cathedral worship as charismatic worship. Our personal space of how these expectations and questions applies to us and to you is for you to decide. But here's a few simple pointers. Is our expectation of people attending our services that they should look and act a certain way? Is it important to explore different types and styles of worship? How can we improve our experience of worship beyond singing? Is it really about what we like and not like in our style, in our song choice, and in our sound? And how do we approach worship when it isn't our style? Just going to finish with the same prayer and blessing we had last time. May God bless us with an anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and turn their pain to joy. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in the world, so that you can do what others claim cannot be done. Amen. Preparation for our next session. If you could read Leviticus 1 again, but this time read it with a question of, is there any repetition, is there any rhythm to the chapter that might affect how we let it affect us or challenge us? See you next time.